My name's Derek Boczenowski. I work for a company called Compass IT Compliance, and with me is Andy Paull, also from Compass. And today we're going to talk briefly about remote access security and some of the risks and some of the things we can do to make things a little bit safer going around. Obviously, over the last year or so, the need to be able to work remotely has exploded exponentially. And with that is the need to make sure that best security practices are in place, more so than ever before when trying to secure what used to be maybe 5 or 6 workstations. You could be up to a couple of hundred now. So we're just going to kind of go through and talk about some best practices and risks and how you might be able to mitigate them. Let's see. So a little bit about Compass. Compass was started in 2010, and we provide IT security, compliance, and risk management services. And our job, we partner with different organizations of scope and size out there to help analyze and mitigate risk and provide services around those items. So a quick agenda is I will start with a little bit of fluff and around the history of remote access for just to prove how old I happen to be. We'll go quickly past that slide and go into some common use cases, and then we'll talk about the risks and some of the security controls around them, and we'll leave a little bit at the end for comments and questions. I know when we got the invite, I think the invite is scheduled 1 to 3. We time this out, and this isn't going to be there should be an hour at the outside, but if everybody is super interested and has a ton of questions, we can absolutely go longer. So without further ado, here we go. So remote access wasn't always the wonderful ease of use thing that it is today. I was thinking about this while I was writing up the PowerPoint presentation, and so a little bit of a history is it was probably for me about I was going to say it was probably about 15 years ago, but it was 25 years ago actually, when I was doing remote access for a municipality in Massachusetts. And they made me bring home a dumb terminal and plug into a phone line and connect into the system to do some IT service work for them on nights and weekends and run processes, so I didn't have to stay at the office until 8 o'clock at night. The interesting thing about it is, as I recall, it was one line. You called one of 2 phone numbers. They always connected. And as long as you had a username and password, you got to go anywhere and do anything. It was very, very simple from an access standpoint. And there was no, with the dumb terminal, there's nothing, once you turned it off, there was nothing in my house any longer, but I had access to everything. Fast forward a little bit, and file sharing became all the rage. FTP servers, not really remote access per se, but sharing documents back and forth, and all the problems that came out from that. That's when you really started to see some issues around security, because FTP servers were notoriously insecure, and which is why they came out with SFTP and FSPT and TTPT and all sorts of TPs. But it really kind of, it started to gain steam into usernames and passwords. That's where things like Telnet and our login came in. Again, not great, but you had a username and password into a system to be able to get in and do what you needed to do. So it was a little bit easier. In some cases, Telnet didn't require a password, but it was a little bit more secure out there. Go a little bit further, and they said, well, we want encryption. We want security around this, about being able to log in. So SSH came along. And then things that we'll be talking about over the course of the next hour, VPNs. And so encrypted tunnels, so people can't see what you're sending back and forth, usernames and passwords, And if you notice, the last couple of bullets I have on my slides here say, starting with SSH, the end to all your security issues. And one of the reasons that I wanted to start with this and come through is that it seems that every new risk comes up with a new piece of technology to fix it, or a new way to get around it, or a new way, something else to present, whether it be SSH or VPN or multi-factor authentication and or zero trust. And everyone that came out, this was going to fix it. You don't have to worry about it anymore once this is implemented because it's bulletproof. And everybody quickly finds out that nothing is bulletproof. You work hard enough, you're going to get away around anything. But this slide kind of shows that everything builds on each other. So we go from, encrypted tunnels in VPN to yes, but still a username and password pretty much. So then you can use things like multi-factor authentication, which is we'll get into a little bit in the future. And now they've said, well, we can break multi-factor authentication. So now what do we do? And there are some possibilities there, but it doesn't mean that multi-factor is bad or that you shouldn't use it just because you might be able to get around it. So what do we use all this remote access for? And there are a couple of different things that we go through and we use it for. The IT people who are on the line are most familiar with, the first couple of bullets is system support and infrastructure maintenance. So the remote system support is out there. That one is actually more geared toward third-party vendors coming in, and you have systems, you have applications that you're running, but run into a problem. You may not be the expert. You need a patch. You need a fix that you can't provide. So company A, company B says, of course we can help you. Here's a link. You click on this link and you let us into your system and we'll fix everything up for you. So remote system report. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I'm going to jump in there too. And for the infrastructure maintenance as well. So both of these may have the same connection types. They may be able to, they may require exactly the same controls, but it's the purposes for remote system support and infrastructure maintenance that might be different. So remote system support would generally be based on a ticket or based on a specific issue that someone has. It may require exactly the same authorization type, the same remote access type, but infrastructure maintenance is something that is more planned. It would be on a schedule or it'd be expected. So that would be the difference. With infrastructure maintenance, there may be routine to it, whereas remote system support might be something that comes in and requires an SLA and would give vendors or IT time to prepare.
That's correct. And Andy has given you a precursor of one of the things we'll talk about is, do the vendors need 24/7 access to get into your systems to do what they need to do? And that may or may not be necessary to do that. But the next category, internal support from home. This is something near and dear to IT people's hearts. Is it's 8 o'clock at night, we got to run the nightly process. Oh, it's 11:30 and a server crashed. It's on the weekend, or you're on vacation, which is something that all of us have run into at one time or another. And so this is a way, this is a way for internal staff to be able to keep things running or check on things or go through stuff. Normally, it wasn't used as a everyday login or the ability to truly work from home. It was something you had to do outside of your normal business hours to be able to do that. And that's in a lot of cases where remote access kind of stopped until a couple of years ago, especially for many businesses. There are some, the virtual companies and a lot of cloud systems where everything felt remote, but a lot of traditional businesses didn't use a lot of home workers. And a perfect example is financial institutions. Very, very infrequently did I see banks and credit unions with a large subset of remote workers. And even the ones that had them rarely, if ever, used them. And now I see upwards of 35, 40% of staff that, not only had to work from home for an extended period of time, but continue to do so now. And then, of course, the last bullet is truly working from home, something that COVID has brought out in a huge way for many organizations. And some of the differences here are it really becomes a home office where everything that you could do at the office, you're doing from home. And it could be a small company like ours where most of our staff is remote. I see a lot of departments that use call centers. They didn't skip a beat in most cases because of COVID. They sent everybody home with equipment and had them work from their house, just like a departmental call center, or it could be a whole organization, depending on what kind of organization you're using. Obviously, in this day and age, what we're finding is, do we need to even come back to the office now? So for those people, remote access is access. And so the controls you have around it will make and break your environment. So what are some of these risks? Well, the biggest one is you're letting people from the outside into your internal network. So kind of an obvious one. But the big thing is that you're giving corporate system and data access to possibly not only people who don't work for your organization like vendors, but people who may work for your organization who are not using company equipment. So if you allow that sort of environment where people are doing, we'll call it bring your own device, but you're not actually bringing it on anywhere, it's more of use your own device, then you have devices in your network now that you no longer control or have the ability to shut down or monitor, things like that. When you allow for remote access, you allow for data to be moved back and forth between the corporate system and external devices. Not in every case. There are some systems that try and prevent that in many, many cases, but it's not always easy. And in a lot of cases, the bottom line is you're going to be able to get data, especially if you're internal to the company, and work on it from your desk on your desktop. And so it's out no longer inside the organization, and that poses a big risk. As we spoke of before, there's, once the devices are outside of your traditional brick and mortar environment, there can be fewer security controls. A lot of the assessments we did and still do, when we take a look at security controls, we ask, how are you patching? How are you monitoring your devices? What are your firewall controls? What's I used antivirus here. I have to start using anti-malware endpoint protection instead of just antivirus. But how are you updating those controls? How are you making sure that those are still working and in place if you hand somebody a laptop and send them home? And while there are systems that can do this, a lot of people weren't equipped at the time to be able to engage those as soon as it hit.
And it's good. I just want to follow up on that a little bit too. And it's also good to note, due to lack of enforcement, there is an assumption that the workforce who is performing remote access has an awareness of a standard security control, and we will kind of follow up with that later in this presentation. But because of the inability to confirm if some baseline controls are in place to protect that access, it makes it a lot harder to have any kind of control or the actual enforcement of those connections and security during those connections.
Very well said. Next, going on, the working from home, I'm sure everybody has seen phishing, ransomware, malware attack. Just in the news over the last couple of days, everything. I'm not sure where everybody is coming in from. Obviously, this is ISAC in New England, but all of meat packing plants and Martha's Vineyard steamship authorities have been compromised by ransomware in recent days. And I can't tell you the amount of increased targets for phishing emails that I receive on alerts on a regular basis. And the bad actors know this, and they target people working from home. They target everybody, but you know, where in a brick and mortar environment, you could actually, in a lot of cases, people would just say, hey, can you come over and look at this? This looks weird to me. Now, a lot of people won't take the extra time to reach out to the IT department or anything else like that. They may not even notice. They may click on something. They say, oh, what's the big deal?
And sometimes they think they can resolve it themselves.
Unsecured networks. Now this has been, for, we tend to travel for our job, or we used to travel for our job a lot more. So I used to work a lot out of hotels and airports and things like that. So, and you do, if you're accessing company resources, remember, you're doing that off a network that you have no idea about, where you may have taken pains to make sure that your home network is relatively secure and in place and ready to go. Although, some people do, some people don't. You can't necessarily make that assumption where hotels and places that, cafes and Starbucks and things like that. So it's something you need to be careful of in that environment. And then something that was near and dear to my heart, because I saw it happening thanks to the big push going home, were bandwidth and access issues. And one of the reasons I used to, the company I used to work for, I should say the financial institution I used to work for, could never understand why sometimes, everything was so slow working from home. And we didn't dedicate enough bandwidth. And there wasn't enough, it wasn't a relatively big pipe at the time, 10, 12 years ago, to do remote access. So snowstorm would hit and you'd have 15 people try and get on and do a bunch of stuff. And it wasn't the greatest thing. And what happened now was you went from 5 to 30, 40, 50 people all using that pipe and things that weren't used to it. So that creates access issues, and that creates support calls, and that creates very stressed IT people trying to fix things that they may have absolutely no control over. So there were a lot of people looking to increase bandwidth during COVID just to be able to handle remote access stuff. And then finally, an inconsistent user experience. And Andy, I think I'll let you, this is one you added, correct?
Yeah, so this kind of aligns with the above bullet. Because of the bandwidth and access issues, generally everybody's going to have somewhat of a different experience trying to use remote access. And not only that, not every corporation implements a standardized way of remoting in. Some organizations might say, hey, you just need to have a VPN and then come into our network like that. And there's no standard as to what VPN you might use. And then we have people that travel and people that work off of Wi-Fi and people that hardline. So not everybody is going to be able to have exactly the same experience trying to do this. And that results in more support calls and possibly maintenance, and then it snowballs into changing policies and updating security controls and trying to standardize things across the board.
And again, that's a super point, because it kind of leads into where we're going to go on the next slide. And now that we've kind of said that all is lost and the sky is falling, is there anything we can do to stop some of this from happening? And the answer, of course, is yes. And Andy brought up an inconsistent experience. Everybody had to scramble. There's no two ways about it to kind of put a lot of these things in place. And people are just getting to the point now where they're realizing that, maybe not everybody has the same experience because of the equipment they have, or how things were set up, or what access they had. So the reason this is the first bullet out here when you talk about mitigating risks is we always advise that people take a step back and take a look at what their policies are around remote access. And this goes into, this touches on several areas: the acceptable use policy, remote access, data protection, all sorts of things like that. But at the bottom line, I don't need to read the bullets. is you want to understand what you're granting, why you're granting it, and what people should be doing around it. That's the biggest thing out there. And you want to start with it. It's kind of a top-down approach. And you're going to find probably little things back and forth that may not be right, things you want to fix. And it also allows you, with a strong policy and a strong process, it allows you to disseminate that to users and third parties and everybody. So everybody understands the same thing, is that, you have, we're going to grant you VPN access. It's only going to be between the hours of 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. I actually had a bank that put those restrictions in place because they were very risk averse and didn't want people logging in after normal business hours. They wanted the exact same experience they had at their office, which I actually didn't necessarily agree with. They were all but it's a security issue. And I said, well, explain to me why. Well, it just is. And I said, okay. And they were, it was what they wanted to do. So they did it. And there was no problem with it. But that's one of the things you're taking a look at when you run, when you start with policies and process, is take a look at who your users are and what do they need access to, and where are they accessing things from, and what are the risks by being able to do that. And that'll allow you to write strong policies and processes around that sort of stuff. I think a lot of people are going to find that they're going to kind of backfill in that and get them going if they're going to do that. Next major, go ahead, Andy.
No, I was just going to follow up. Although it's hard for an organization to be able to confirm what their remote workforce is implementing for security controls. Regarding minimum security requirements, there is no way really or truly for a company to say, hey, before you can access our network, we need to go in and make sure that you have these things on your personal computer, because in the end, those devices are your property. But as a condition of being able to remotely access any system at the organization, they can have minimum requirements set by policy, whether it's the acceptable use, the IT security policy, or cybersecurity policy, to say, hey, at a minimum, you need to have this antivirus installed. You need to have at least a personal firewall, whether it's on the computer or in your network somewhere. And you need to be able to have some sort of authentication method to get into any systems that do connect to us directly. And that just gives one small layer of control, indirect, but still a layer of control to say, hey, if you want to get into this network from somewhere that is not here under our enforced controls, you can still do it. Otherwise, there may be requirements to have corporate systems pushed out to the workforce, or they will have to come into an office to do the work.
That's right. And again, not every company can implement every solution. So to Andy's point, is you may not be able to have corporate resources. You may, you might have to use personal computers, and that's where and you may not be sophisticated enough or advanced enough to have firewalls and equipment, where you are, to be able to detect that somebody's coming in and has a good version of Windows or antivirus or, everything that's on there that you're demanding. However, what you can have is a policy that says we require this, and if we find that you're not using it, then you have the possibility of losing VPN, losing remote access, and or being written up or disciplined for violating policy. So it's, again, that's kind of the top-down approach. Obviously, if you can use corporate resources to be able to allow for remote access, it makes it a lot easier on the back end for support and being able to have that control over those systems. You may not have 100% control, but it's much easier to say, okay, I'm giving you a clean machine. I know exactly what's on it. I've locked it down, so you can only do A, B, and C. And if something goes wrong, you can bring it back in, or I have stuff in place to be able to troubleshoot it, or I can wipe it and give you a new one in 2 hours, versus being hey, my personal computer seems to be running slow. Can you help me? So you can really go down a rat hole where that's concerned. And but for, in addition to policies and procedures, we talked a little bit about technical solutions. And what's really coming forth now more and more are some of the security solutions, things like antivirus and vulnerability scanning and system monitoring. Things are in place. They have what are called cloud agents, and a cloud agent will allow you to install a program on the remote desktop endpoint, and it will report back. Not only will it report back on kind of the system status and what it is, but it'll allow you to have Windows patches installed. It'll allow you to send information to see what vulnerabilities are on the machine. It will do antivirus without having you directly connected to the corporate network to be able to do that sort of stuff. And this is an area that is growing very, very fast and furious with remote access in there. So there absolutely are technical controls that can be used to give you that kind of ability to monitor and review remote desktops, even when you're not directly VPN'd in and connected to the corporate network. And that's something that is, should be looked at very, very strongly, especially if you're looking at either rolling out a new remote access system or solution, or you've decided, now that COVID is starting to recede, we're starting to take a deeper look into, what we're doing and how we're doing it, and close the gaps on security.
One of the nice benefits about being able to install agents too is that they have relatively no impact on the end user. Most of the time, the end user won't even know the agent is there. And it's something that you can include as one of those minimum security controls for a remote system. You say, hey, we need to have the ability to put this agent on. You won't see it. It won't have any impact, but we can still get statistical data from your system. We can still track connection logs and things like that. So there are benefits to bandwidth utilization system processing as well, not just on the security side.
Correct. And as you heard Andy filter out a little bit as he was talking, bandwidth is absolutely an issue all the way across. So next slide. You've probably heard this ad nauseum to mitigate remote access risk. Use multi-factor authentication. Now, this to me is not just a remote access risk. I like to see multi-factor authentication. If you're sitting at your desk on the network, in the building, just because the majority of compromises, the majority of issues come from two major sources. And the first one is compromised credentials. People who just use username and password. I happen to do quite a few clean desk walkthroughs for some of my risk assessments and things like that. And you would be shocked how many passwords and things I've found just by lifting a keyboard or opening a drawer and seeing all sorts of things like that. There was one place that actually handed out password books, little tiny, maybe 2x3 things where you can write down all your usernames and passwords. And some people did. So it made it very, very easy to go and get that sort of stuff. So multi-factor authentication is a way to enhance usernames and passwords. And and we usually look at it as a triangle. It's something something you have, something you are. Something you know is a password. Something you have could be like a token, where you get a certain code based on your token, and you put that token in, and you go and you get access along with your password. Something you are could be a fingerprint. Everybody, loves to say retina scans and things like that, dental records, but it's something, it's at least two of those three components. Now, Depending on how technical the group is, I'm sure, at least some of you have heard that, they've been able to crack multi-factor authentication and certain, and get in and defeat certain systems and things like that. They absolutely have. Like I said, nothing is perfect. But here's the way I look at it: is username and password is coming up to somebody's house and there's a lock on the door, and just it's standard regular old door with a lock on it. And multi-factor authentication is a deadbolt about 6 inches above the lock. Now I can tell you in my own house, I have locked myself out on multiple occasions. And as long as I have my wallet with me and the deadbolt isn't on, I've been able to get into the house using a credit card. I didn't pay anybody for it. And in 2 cases, I broke the credit card, but I could get past that lock because it's a relatively simple lock. That's kind of the password. However, the deadbolt's on, I'm not getting in without, chopping into the door or doing something drastic. So yes, there are ways to get past it, but think of it this way: if it costs somebody so much time and effort to compromise you, and they could turn around, walk up the street and compromise somebody else just because they had a password, that's where they're going to go. Nothing is perfect, but it's certainly, it's all about mitigating risk, not eliminating risk. And at this point, using multi-factor authentication has gotten much, much easier. Anything from, Google has it. I have several clients who use Duo, which I happen to love. I think it's an easy implementation, and I think it works fairly, well, but you're not getting in unless you have my phone. And if you've stolen my phone and everything else like that, hopefully I was smart enough to get rid of it and call Verizon and have them delete it or wipe it or whatever. But bottom line is the more you can secure access at all, the lower the risk is going to be for that remote access.
I think it's good too to point out the distinction between MFA and 2FA, which was somewhat alluded to before. Whereas MFA is something you have, something you are, something you know. 2FA is more of a layered security. And I have seen this confused multiple times that, hey, well, if we have to log into our firewall first through a VPN, and then we also have to log into a system, aren't we doing it in a multi-factor sense? And no, that's actually 2FA. You're essentially using 2 things to access a single resource versus having the trifecta, as Derek put it, the 3 separate items that require 3 different points of impact on the connection. So just wanted to throw that out there, that there is that distinction. 2FA and MFA are not the same thing. One is layered and one is more robust and 3-dimensional.
Sure. And the next major area, I don't need to belabor. I don't think anybody, needs to hear a 15-minute dissertation on patching. But I said earlier in the presentation that breaches come from 2 main places. We talked about compromised credentials. The other one is unpatched systems. So here's the thing about remote access. It's much more difficult to make sure those systems are patched and that the vulnerabilities are closed in them as well. So that's one of the reasons I talked about cloud agents, because that can go a long way to helping you. You may ask that somebody, that they bring in the systems at least once every 60 days if you have to patch them manually, so you can do a review from where that is, where that's concerned. But the one of the things I found at an institution I was looking at a couple of weeks ago was that their on-site systems had been patched within an inch of their life. There were almost no vulnerabilities outstanding. The laptops, on the other hand, there weren't any critical updates that needed to be happened, but the mid-level ones were, there were a ton of them because it wasn't a patch that was needed, believe it or not. It was just a vulnerability. They had old TLS stuff running and things that they were relatively easy fixes, but because they didn't see them and had no access to be able to, make those changes and update them, the vulnerabilities got left out there. So that's one of the things to really, you need a method, one way, whether it's with a technical control or a physical control, i.e., hey, today is Patch Tuesday. Everybody bring your laptops in and hook them up, and we will, we're going to make sure and run scans for you. Obviously, if you're a small company, if you don't have chances that at a minimum, or if it's a BYOD environment, advise that they turn auto patching on to have that stuff up and running so that it's patching as much as humanly possible to be able to do that. And then direct desktop connections. Andy, do you want to talk on that briefly?
Sure. Yeah, so despite the sound of my voice, I'm actually old enough to remember a time when remote desktop terminal connections were one of the most common ways of accessing a UI remotely. And this was obviously based around Windows. But what I saw a lot of organizations doing, and really this was municipalities, schools. I had a jewelry store once that had this set up. A lot of these RDP connections were done through the default port being passed through the firewall as an exception, 3389. So back when this was really prevalent, organizations would just open up port 3389. They would allow remote desktop connections either from support or from remote workers. I remember many times I had to jump in on a direct connection into an environment, and particularly for the jewelry store, that actually resulted in a breach because after a connection, another IT company had come in and set up that connection to stay open. And even though it had a timeout period, they had input a script that would perform an auto logon. That auto logon allowed that terminal session to be opened again on a periodic basis or on a time schedule. And they actually ended up being breached because of that. Someone stole their entire inventory of what jewelry they had in stock, what jewelry they had on order, and it did result in a burglary at one point. So an important thing to look at here is with remote desktop connections, it's convenient, especially if you're just doing it direct through an open port. The problem is that also makes it convenient for malicious actors. They just do a port scan of an environment. They look for those open ports of 3389. And there are obviously ways that you can mitigate that if you're still using remote desktop as a primary way of remote access. I still work with organizations that use remote desktop from home. Workforce will simply get onto a session, connect to their workstations, either in a thin client environment or into an actual physical machine that they have at their location. And the best way to get around this is use a VPN. So set up a VPN that requires you connection to the internal network first, and then remote desktop from a well-known workstation or a virtual machine or something like that. And the other thing is also change those ports. Change your default RDP port. That should happen regardless of whether or not you're using a VPN. But I saw it all the time, and that jewelry store, that the breach that they had, because it resulted in a real world burglary, I think it's a great example of either why RDP shouldn't be used at all anymore, or if you do, you need to layer the security with VPN and changing those ports, or just shut it off altogether. And that's all I have to say on that.
All right. Sorry for the technical difficulties, guys. Lost the presentation for a minute, but we're back. So thank you, Andy, for helping out while I went down and came back up. Anyway, couple of common sense things flying in from on the next slide is using proper access controls. Obviously, things like least privilege. Preventing unauthorized connections. Basically, think about what controls you have in your internal systems. You don't want everybody being able to access everything. You have administrators, you have users, you have power users, you have stuff like that. Remote access should not give anybody any additional, system access than they had before. And a lot of, especially the older VPNs, things like that, the older setups, it was, hey, log in, you'll get assigned an IP, and you have access to our network, and not you have access to what you had before, which we've segmented the network out, or we'll only give you access to these VLANs or anything else like that. So review the access controls for remote access to make sure that you have the same, that same level. The other thing This is for it's for internal users, but especially for third parties or vendors or anything else like that. There's today's tools, today's VPNs, today's firewalls, everything. So have a lot of different tools to be able to limit access. Things like inactivity timeouts, and in a lot of cases, if you're trying to be regulated by PCI or one of the other frameworks, they look for them. So things like inactivity timeouts, nobody, very, very few people are on for 12 hours straight. So set it so after a certain amount of time, it's it forces you off, especially inactivity. Time of day. I was telling you about about the financial institution earlier that said we're only allowing 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. And you may not allow access on weekends for employees or anything else like that. There's a couple of good reasons. One, if you start seeing people logging in on Sunday morning at 2 a.m. without a good reason, you should be suspicious. If you block them so they can't get in, you should be really suspicious. Geolocations, we get alerts from Office 365 all the time that somebody's trying to log in to one of our accounts here at Compass, and it can't possibly be happening because you're already logged in and they're trying to log in from 4,000 miles away. Things like that. So the end of, we don't have to belabor it. The end of the day is take a look at the access controls and make sure that what you would set up for your internal network at least is there for the external network, and then, probably go a step further. Monitor everything. Well, this one is, in terms of remote access, you want to know when people are trying to get into your system, whether they're successful, whether it's a failure, anything else like that. A lot of the companies I work with have a daily review of this. And I look very, very specifically at, okay, so-and-so tried to get in 15 times and was never successful. Did they say anything? Did they reach out? That alone makes me want to call them and say, were you trying to get in? Is there a problem? Can I help? Because if they say, oh yeah, I had a big problem. Okay, no problem. We'll fix that. Or more importantly, no, I didn't try to get in. All right, well, we're changing all your stuff right now because something's going wrong. So reviewing those, and again, a lot of the systems that you use now should provide daily reports for access and how much time and what systems and files were out there. Not all of them, but definitely everything you can take a look at. You want to make sure you have the ability to review, because at the end of the day, in a lot of cases, this is not only a preventive control if it stops people from getting in, but it's what we call a detective control. If you do have to go back or you do have to figure out something that happened, being able to know who got in when and who did what can make all the difference in the world. And then finally, for this slide, this is another common sense one. If you don't need it, don't turn it on. And this is not only for remote access, whereas you shouldn't give them access to the entire network if they log in, but it also applies to whatever machine they happen to be on. Is that you should be able to, especially if it's a corporate machine, remove, lock down, do whatever you can, turn off stuff if you don't need it. One, it means you don't have to support it. And two, there's less of something going wrong or needing to be patched or anything else like that. So this goes back to the policy and the rollout and the process. When you're thinking these things through, these are steps that you should be putting into place before you hand that laptop and those VPN controls over to a user. A couple of things on VPN specifically and remote access. There are things called tunneling. And the great things about VPN is that it sets up a secure tunnel from tip to tail so that people aren't, sniffing the traffic that goes back and forth and can't read stuff that's unencrypted. And so it's very, very good. There are two main ways of doing tunneling. There's called split tunneling and full tunneling. Even though I put split tunneling first in this, I'm going to talk about full tunneling because it's easier. Full tunneling means everything. It means once you connect for the VPN, everything in that laptop goes through the VPN or machine goes through the VPN. So it means if you go to Google, you're going to Google through your corporate environment. You know, if you want to play a game, you're playing a game towards a corporate environment. The good news is all those security controls you put in place in your, in your building, the remote user has. So it actually becomes very, very sick, because if you have web filtering, if you have alerting, if you have all of that kind of kicks in, because everything is running through the tunnel. The downside is everything is running through the tunnel. It means it's going to use, your bandwidth for all of it. So somebody is working for a couple hours and decides to watch a video because you haven't locked it down. That video bandwidth is going through your environment, and everything along with it. It is, it's easier to control. It can be considered more secure because you're filtering everything through your firewalls and your sniffers and everything else like that. But it will be a higher cost in bandwidth. The reverse of that is called split tunneling. And in split tunneling, the VPN looks for specific addresses that are work addresses and says, okay, if you're going to go here, and here, use the VPN. If you go anywhere else, then you use whatever your internet connection is. Speeds up access. You're going to find with full tunneling, it probably, web surfing's probably going to be a little bit slower. Some things aren't going to run as well. You might have problems with voice connections. Usually in split tunneling, if it doesn't have to go through the network, you'll have the same experience you'd have sitting in your house. But you also don't have that control. If you're in an environment that really needs to be locked down and secured and things like that, users going to non-work sites are going through the internet. They're not going through your system anymore. There's an increase for the chances of malware and things to be downloaded from malicious sites. And then because you're still VPN'd in, can be passed up to your environment. There's no one great decision to be made one way or the other. It's, take a look at your risk, take a look at your bandwidth, and see what's available. I have I have one financial institution. Every time I get into their system, it's full tunnel, which actually means I have a separate device that I use just for that, because it means I can't look at any of my own email or do anything else. I'm locked into their environment. But at the same time, I'm not worried about anything going back and forth or having any problems. Most of the VPN I see at this point is split tunneling, only because of bandwidth reasons. But it's something that you want to take a look at and say, hey, our security posture says X, and based on that, we're going to use full tunneling, which means we need more bandwidth. Our security posture is Y. We can afford split tunneling. We're not giving access to any secure environments or anything else like that, and that's what it is. And then to offset this a little bit, they have, for technical controls, a lot of companies use what are called load balancers, which basically takes a look at all that traffic that runs back and forth and tries to assist in routing the traffic, based on, who's doing what the traffic is. If it's voice traffic, they have things called quality of service, so that it gets priority. They can, if bandwidth is really a problem, if you can route it somewhere else to kind of ease it off, it'll do that sort of thing. And so it can decrease that load to an extent to be able to help that sort of stuff run. But these are all, this is all about getting into the environment and some of the risks, because obviously at the end of the day, if you can't do your work effectively, then that alone, is a risk in what it is. Another thing to consider in the older days. I had a chat. So, I had a question specifically for this. So one of the questions we had is, with full tunneling, users are unable to print to local home printers. That is almost always the case, unless the printer is an internet printer that you allow to print from anywhere, which means if you were sitting at your house, sitting in the office, you could send something to your home printer. So yes, that's another thing to consider, is that in a lot of cases, full tunneling will lock you down. So you won't see that, it won't connect to that printer anymore, because what the traffic is doing is you say, print to my printer, and it goes over to the corporate network and looks for your printer and says, I can't find it. So VDI environments, virtual desktop environments, and these are gaining a lot of traction lately. So what these are in the old days, I used to use something called terminal server, which was everybody logging into a server and working off that server so that you didn't have to have as much processing power on the desktop. Well, this is the next iteration of that. And the nice thing about this is basically you log in and the corporate gives you an environment that is your desktop, which means your desktop is not on your laptop at all. And everything you do is in the corporate environment. So it's kind of like logging into the environment, then logging on to your system in that environment, but it's much more secure. Now, the nice things about that is the bandwidth is usually a little bit lower. Well, I shouldn't say the bandwidth. The processing is better because you're doing processing on the corporate network. Depending on what you see or what you're playing or things like that, bandwidth could be positive or negative. But the big thing about this is with virtual desktops, the IT department and the corporation can, has everything on site, which means patching and control and the ability to troubleshoot. They all have local. And normally what they'll give is either lockdown laptops or laptops that can't do anything but connect to the VPN, which makes it very, very easy to troubleshoot and fix things. If you have a problem with a VDI environment, oh, my desktop is all messed up. This isn't working. This isn't, this isn't going go. 9 times out of 10, all they're going to say is, okay, give me a minute. They're going to get rid of it. They'll give you a brand new one and you'll be up to go. So remote system requirements are minimal. Patching and security is going to be minimal depending on what they give you. And then you have, so the IT management usually becomes a little bit easier from that standpoint. Now, one of the possible downsides is, if you happen to be sitting at a desk and that's all you do and that's what you're doing, that's great. If you're a workforce traveler, if you're a mobile person who is, again, in coffee shops and this and that and everything else like that, you may need a lot of local features because you're not connected to the internet or the VPN in a lot of cases. So again, know your environment, know who you're giving this to be able to do that sort of stuff. A lot of call centers, a lot of, departments that are going remote use VDI environments because the call center staff shouldn't be expected to, make sure patching or monitoring or anything else is there. They just want to log in and start doing their job. And they want, and the company wants everything to look absolutely identical and turn it off at the end of the night. So it gives you a lot more control and management. But you have to put it in the VDI infrastructure. So there could be, especially in the initial years, there could be a greater cost involved with doing that. As time goes, you'll get some of that back by lower management costs and lower remote access costs.
Yeah, and I want to throw one out there that's pretty relevant and prevalent now. Citrix used to have their Zendesk environment, which was essentially turning any machine you use into a thin client, connecting into a Citrix server setup, which was a VDI of its own. Everyone had their own virtual desktop. But the other one, that both Windows operating systems and Citrix and some Linux operating systems had the capability to do was app publishing, which is another form of remote access. It's not, it's not direct access to a full UI. Instead, it's only promoting specific applications remotely. So you can open an application and what it has to do is run through the internet to be able to connect to a remote server to access the content from that particular application. But it's still considered a type of VDI or remote connection.
Perfect. Absolutely true. So then a couple other things. When you had 5 users and they were all IT and they couldn't get into the VPN, guess what they did? They got up and drove into the office and grumbled because it was 11 o'clock at night and all of a sudden the VPN wasn't working. And you had to do stuff. Now that you have 60, if the VPN goes down, what happens to your organization, and what do you do in the meantime? So think about, a lot of VPNs run through the firewalls, and a lot of firewalls have what's called high availability. If you have two standing side by side and one fails, it'll fail right over to the other one. I also know companies that have alternate VPNs. If they have more than one location, they'll put a VPN in each one. And if one goes down, they just fail over to the other one, and they log into the other one. So from a business standpoint, think about the risk of everybody using one system, and is your current system a single point of failure? So consider what you might need to make sure that if it is, that you expand that so that you can either put a replacement in right away, have high availability, have a secondary system available in another location, all sorts of things like that. Because in this environment where so many people are working from home, if you have to get into corporate resources to do your job, that becomes not only a bottleneck, but it becomes a big point of failure and a risk if it isn't working for any length of time. And then we talked about this in a couple of different ways, is end user devices and end user network security. Starting from, don't make the assumption that wherever these people happen to be, that it's secure, and that they're, they understand what it takes to make everything that way. So this goes back to using corporate devices is always great, is always easier and almost always more secure. But in terms of, if you're using your own devices, things like that, that's where it comes to the policies and saying, hey, there needs to be, I did put endpoint protection. Good. Instead of antivirus, local firewalls, access controls, things like that are all there. And then it goes to coffee shops and things like that. Always, if you're in hotels or coffee shops or things like that, using the VPN creates a secure tunnel. So always, I would say that if you are in those areas, having a VPN is going to make your experience much more secure than using their network to do what they need to do. Other people, quite on, I'll be very honest. If I'm in a hotel and I have a decent signal, I won't even use the hotel network. I'll tether right to my phone and go through my phone to do most of what I need to do, simply because it's a closed system, not really, but it's more secure than a hotel network that I'm not familiar with, and 300 people could be on doing God knows what. So, and then last but not least, I wanted to point this out a little bit. This is not truly what I would call a remote access risk in and of itself, but this is moving along forward if we're looking towards the future. And that was why I put that initial slide on with going everything from, dial up and dumb terminals all the way to telnet and going through to VPN. And then you have somebody popping their head up off a security list saying, oh, no, we broke that encryption. No, MFA isn't secure anymore. You can't do that. What's this? So this isn't a new idea. This has been around for multiple years, but the technology is getting to the point where it's being a little bit easier to implement. And it's something called zero trust, and zero trust is just that. It's basically the ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend of the trust environment, where you don't trust them for anything. So anything you do, you log in, you want to use a printer, you want a network resource, you want to go to a share file, it does a sanity check against it. So, and it is, it takes quite a bit to set it up and set it up properly, because basically you have policy and rules that, kind of centralize and everything runs through it. So Fred wants a printer. Did you allow Fred to have a printer? Fred wants, access to this share. Did we allow this? Did we allow it based on date and time? Did we allow it? Okay, Fred can have the printer if he's sitting in the office, but we're going to deny him the ability to get the printer, if he's working from home. you may have heard things called segmentation, and this is even within environments, even within certain VLANs and segmented environments. You can further cross them off so that you only have access to truly the machines that you need to do your job, and nothing more. And the reason I bring this up is this all ties back into, what are you granting when you grant somebody remote access into your network? Have you done the exercise of going through this? So, and in this environment, any request goes through a series of rules to say yay or no, nay. Again, to do this, you have to understand what people need and what the access requirements. So this isn't something I'm saying, go out and go to one of the vendors. If they say zero trust, go ahead and set it up, because it'll take 2 seconds for you. No, this is for people that say, okay, we're securing, we need to secure our environment. We have lots of remote access. We have lots of non-remote access, but we want to lock this up so that people can get into stuff that they need to from anywhere, doing what we want to do. And we understand what our data is and our roles is. And these are for organizations big enough, basically, with somebody to manage it and manage this environment and run with it and things like that. So what I wanted to kind of close with that, because again, is this the next great thing? Maybe. It's getting a lot of play. It's getting a lot of talk. Is it bulletproof? No. And I can tell you right now why it's not bulletproof, because a human has to set up the rules to do that sort of stuff. And at the end of the day, if you don't set up the rules right, if you don't do this, then things could, bad things could happen. And I'm sure 5 years from now, somebody will say, oh, this was defeated, let's go to the next thing. So it's kind of a one step ahead where it comes to, remote access and access controls. So we came in at just over an hour, and that was my goal. So I'm glad we didn't. Hopefully everybody, or most of the people, are still awake. And I know we had one question, and so I just kind of wanted to open it up and see if there were any other questions. And obviously, thank you all for participating and listening to Andy and I talk for a bit. Let's see, we've got one. What are my thoughts on knowledge-based questions? So, okay. I will say that if it's, one of the things I really enjoy, I don't use Facebook much, but I troll it. I don't have that many friends, but the friends I do have, I love seeing things like, hey, your superhero name is now the name of your, your first name, the name of your dog, and the name of your first car. and there's I do a face palm. So I say, are you kidding me? The issue with knowledge-based questions is most of them can be sniffed out fairly easily. To get the answers to those. They're okay in a limited fashion to be able to do that. Some systems do use them to kind of prove you're you, and that's I've a lot of banks for mortgage applications or getting credit or things like that. They'll say, hey, you didn't live at one of these houses in the last 20 years. Pick the one that was, that you didn't live at. And a couple of them have been I've had to look a couple of them up, questions about me, but the thing was I could find them. So I'm not a huge fan of them. I'm much better. I much better like something you have, like a good token access. There's a little USB token called a YubiKey that came out a while ago that basically, if you didn't have that key plugged into your machine, you weren't going anywhere or getting anywhere to the corporate network allowed. And now everybody says, well, yeah, but you could lose it and you don't have to. Well, yes, you could. That's part of the thing. Remote access kind of is a privilege and something that you look at from that sort of thing. So that's my opinion. Next question, are there environments that have a higher risk versus patching for others? So you're absolutely right. And it's really, really difficult when you have a decentralized organization, or even I deal with several organizations that don't have a domain anything at all. They're smaller organizations. They have half a dozen MacBooks and they have some Windows stuff that out there. So it's not always easy. And that's why I always say, start with the policy. One of the things I recommended is that in terms of patches, if you can, if they're, especially if they're not your machines, recommend that they turn auto patching on. In most cases, it is for a lot of people anyway, which makes it easy. That helps with the patching and gets the patches in, stuff like that. One of the things that does make me nervous are vulnerabilities that aren't patchable. Now, I'm not talking about zero-day attacks or anything, but vulnerabilities that a patch won't fix. You actually have to go in and change a setting or make a change or anything else like that. So that to me is is kind of a big issue. And there, it's why I lean towards corporate machines in most cases. But it's, some of it is communication. Some of it depends on what systems you're giving access to and are accessing. I have one client that deals with a lot of video, but none of it is sensitive data. And so I asked them point blank, I said, if all of this got compromised or deleted or anything else like that, what's the impact on you? And they said, well, we have a reputational risk, but there's no confidential data or anything else like that, or any issues. And so to your point, your question, there absolutely are environments that have higher risks. Anything that you're dealing with confidential customer information, privacy data, anything else like that, you want to make sure that you have the strongest controls in place. You may be, giving access to people to certain information that's practically public, from that standpoint, and it may not be of the same sort of thing. So those are things that you want to take a look at from that area. So, and then one more question we had was employee connects to the company network by an employee home router. And is there a way that the router is not patched when it's connected? Andy, what do you think? Andy tends to be a little more technical than I am from that standpoint. What do you think about that one?
Yeah, this is difficult to do because unless there is some sort of data being tracked through a public connection of some kind from that device by the organization, which requires consent from the end user, it is not easy to do. It can be done. Usually, it requires some kind of direct access from the company to be able to either implement a service or employ a VPN of some kind to be able to track that kind of information, whether it's connectivity information or even browser information. Some of that can be pulled from internet browser connections, but like I said, it's something that can be done. It's not very common, and that goes back to having those minimum security standards in policy, basically saying, hey, we don't really have the possibility or capability to be able to implement controls on your devices. So here's what we require for you to access using your own technology.
That's that one of the things we didn't really talk about was too much was security awareness training, and kind of if you turn that maybe 45 degrees to the left or so, one of the things that you could take a look at was having not only having that, but maybe having some tips on hey, for good security, take a look at X, Y, and Z on your own systems, not necessarily on ours, but take a look at this. Or once a year, take a look at making sure your router is patched, or once a quarter, or anything else like that. And because normally there are several, and where you guys are cut, in my area, there's Comcast, Xfinity, or Verizon are the two big ones. I know Charter is out, and things like that. And I could look up very easily, how to make sure that's with a couple of keystrokes, how to make that sort of stuff up. So you may want to design a cheat sheet and say, hey, for the employees that are working from home and doing this, can you just do us a favor, do us a little due diligence, take these 3 steps and check the box that you did them, and send the email off to us that it was done. And then you've gone through, not only security awareness, but kind of due diligence that they've said they've got it to a certain level. And if they, then if you get compromised, you have a piece of paper that says, hey, you told us you did this. Why did, obviously you didn't. And it shouldn't be too hard. You have to, know your audience too a little bit, because there are going to be some people that just aren't going to be able to do some of the things you ask them to. I'm going to say probably.
And to follow up on that question, not related to the security awareness, but related to the actual question. So a lot of consumer routers don't have the capability for in-depth management. A lot of it's very simple, and I know Netgear actually has a lot of capability to do some security controls and even provide SNMP data over the internet through a specific port and allow an organization to see that data. That is one way that a company might be able to, at the very least, monitor activity on a remote consumer router. But there are also third-party, more open source router firmwares that can be downloaded to a lot of consumer routers if they allow it. And that might give a consumer router more capability to incorporate governed security on their device. But once again, it kind of comes back down to whether or not that's something the end user wants to allow the company to do, which requires consent, or if it's something that the company wants to push on their workforce, because it could change the culture of the organization, having a organization require access to their home router, which is essentially their gateway to everything, not just to the business.
And me personally, I don't want to go anywhere near that.
I agree.
It's more, figure out what works best and things, and steps you want to take, and then find out the best way to implement them. So, so that was the last question on. So I'm going to wrap it up here by saying thank you very much, everybody who listened to us go on and on. And obviously, if you have any additional questions or concerns, these are, remote access reviews and are some of the things in our wheelhouse of different assessments and security assessments and things like that we do. So if you have questions or concerns, we're always happy to help.